Carlos Camejo woke up freezing cold and totally confused. It was September 6th, 2007, and all Carlos could remember was being on his motorcycle with the hot sun bearing down on him as he wound his way on his bike through the streets of La Victoria, which is a city in Venezuela. Carlos tried to open his eyes, but he couldn't, and then when he tried to move his body, he couldn't do that either. And so he began to panic because he's paralyzed, but he told himself to calm down. If he couldn't move, at least he could think. He could try to process, what's going on here. There has to be an explanation for it. And so Carlos, in total darkness and immobile, began going through over and over again this whole motorcycle trip, which was his last memory. And he remembered that his friend had called him up and asked him to go out on this ride. Carlos used to go out all the time on his bike for fun with his friends and by himself, but now that he was 33 years old and married, he didn't have the time for it as much. But the weather had been so beautiful that when his friend had called and asked to go out, Carlos said, "Let's do it." And so Carlos began going over in his head the route that they had taken through La Victoria, and all he could remember was this long straightaway and then a right turn and then nothing. It was like after he made that turn, everything went blank. And as Carlos thought about how weird it was that one, he was paralyzed, and two, he had no memory of what happened after he made that right turn, he started to realize that he felt something against his back. It was like there was a block underneath his back, kind of right between his shoulder blades, propping his chest up, and he felt his arms kind of dangling down by the side, and it was very uncomfortable. And as he laid in this totally awkward position, he began to hear somewhere out in the ether unfamiliar voices just kind of chatting. And immediately, Carlos is like, okay, someone's here to help me. I don't know what's wrong with me, but somebody's here. I'm going to be okay. And soon, whoever was talking near Carlos had moved closer to him, and actually Carlos began to realize that it was actually more than one person. It was at least two people talking back and forth, but again, Carlos can't open his eyes, he can't move, he can't communicate with these people. He just knows they've come closer to him. And after these people had moved right up against Carlos suddenly felt something metal pressing up against his chin. And it was kind of sharp, and it kind of hurt when it touched his chin. And Carlos wanted to scream out and tell them whatever they were doing to stop and at least tell him what was going on, but Carlos couldn't make a sound. And then Carlos began to hear this kind of mechanical whirring sound, like a machine starting up that was very close to where he was. And suddenly Carlos began panicking, like, what's going on? What are they doing to me? And as Carlos's heart rate is starting to speed up, one of the people who had moved near Carlos suddenly said, "Oh my God, that's impossible. This can't be." And then again, Carlos felt more pain in his chin. And then the pain got dramatically worse. It went from just kind of like a poking feeling to something going into his chin, and he felt it moving underneath his skin like a knife cutting through him, and then whatever it was, it went out of his chin. And as this is happening, Carlos is trying so hard to just wake himself up and do something to tell these people to stop, but he just couldn't do it. And then again, he felt that sharp pain in his chin, another round of something going into him, moving underneath his skin and then poking out again, and the pain became so blinding that suddenly Carlos was able to kind of break through this paralysis, and his eyes shot open. And for a second, all Carlos could see was like blinding lights. But then as things came into focus, he saw there were two people, the people who had been speaking, wearing these huge goggles and face masks, and one of them was holding a big needle with black thread attached to it, and that thread was coming from Carlos's chin. They had been running that needle through his face, stitching his chin for some reason, but with no anesthetic. And so as Carlos is staring up at these people in goggles, the people in goggles are looking down at Carlos, and they're totally horrified, and they just kind of begin backing up, not really sure what to make of this. And then Carlos, again, kind of breaking through this weird paralysis he was under, he was able to lift his head up and look down at his body. And he saw, to his horror, that he was totally nude. He was laying on a metal table, and there was this Y drawn on his chest, starting at his collarbones, coming down right underneath his throat, and then straight down across his chest. And then after Carlos saw this Y on his naked body, he looked over at a tray that was right next to this metal table near these two guys in goggles who were now kind of backing up, and he saw there was a whirring instrument on this table, and it was a circular blade, a saw. That was the sound he heard, and that's when Carlos figured it out. Earlier that day, when Carlos had been out riding his motorcycle with his friend, he had gone down that long straightaway in La Victoria. He had made a right turn and parked illegally. Right after this turn was this big truck. Carlos didn't see it, and at full speed, he impacted the truck. He was thrown from his bike, smashed into the ground, horrific injuries. And when paramedics showed up, they pronounced him dead on the scene. And so he was moved from the scene of the accident to the morgue. And at the morgue, Carlos was stripped naked and put on this metal table, and they placed a block underneath his shoulders, kind of propping his chest up, and they drew a Y down the center of his chest for his autopsy. The two doctors that Carlos ultimately saw chatting and performing this autopsy were going to follow that Y on his body with the circular saw. That's how they cut you open during an autopsy. But right before they were about to do that, the doctors noticed that Carlos was actively bleeding from his chin. And since he was supposed to be dead, that didn't make any sense. And so that was why one of the doctors had said, "Oh my goodness, this can't be." And so not really sure what to make of it, they had just grabbed a needle and begun stitching his face together to stop the blood from going down his chest. And then Carlos opened his eyes, and it dawned on the two doctors that, oh, he's alive. That's why he's still bleeding. We should definitely take care of him now. But amazingly, after Carlos came back from the dead, he was simply moved into the hallway and left on this metal table, and the doctors who were going to perform his autopsy just left the paper that said he needed an autopsy in his pocket, just kind of showing that, hey, we were just following orders. Somebody told us to give you an autopsy. This is not our fault. And that's where Carlos stayed until his wife showed up and found him in the hallway, just laying there as if he was still just waiting for his autopsy. Carlos would suffer horrible injuries from the accident and serious emotional trauma from almost being cut open during this autopsy, but he would make a full recovery. On the afternoon of May 25th, 2017, 42-year-old Nicole Gordon was laying on her couch in her home in Atlanta, Georgia, with an ice pack on her head. She had a blinding headache, one of the worst headaches she had ever had, and she was just unable to do anything else but lay on the couch. Nicole really had no idea why she had this terrible headache. The only thing she could think of was 3 weeks earlier, she had been in a minor car accident, and one of her car windows had broken, and some of the glass had cut her face, but she didn't think that would be enough to lead to this absolutely horrific headache that had not gone away for 3 weeks. But Nicole was a very tough woman, and even though she had thought about going to the hospital over these past 3 weeks to deal with whatever was causing this headache, she had told herself that, it's got to be something minor. I just need to kind of tough it out here. And what toughing it out looked like was laying on the couch all day long, only getting up to eat and go to the bathroom, not going to work, and just sitting in the darkness with this ice pack, just hoping for this headache to go away. And so as Nicole was just laying there, she heard her back door open up. It was her boyfriend, Durante, coming in with groceries. He came inside and he put the groceries away, and then he came into the living room where she was, and he asked how she was doing. And she told him that the headache had not gone away yet, and would he mind going into the kitchen and getting her some ibuprofen, which are pain meds, as well as some water. And so Durante said, of course. He went in the kitchen, he got what she needed, he brought it back. She said thank you, she took the ibuprofen, and then she went back to just being totally miserable. But just a second later, Nicole and Durante heard a knock at the front door, and Durante, he walked over and kind of casually looked through the blinds to see if he could see who was at the front door, and he saw it was Nicole's best friend, Leisha. But instead of going to the door and opening it, Durante turned to Nicole and said, hey, it's Leisha, do you want me to get the door? And Nicole, she just kind of grunted and said, no, please just ignore her. Even though Nicole and Leisha were very close, Nicole knew that Leisha was very high energy. She had been calling and texting basically nonstop ever since Nicole had begun getting these headaches. Leisha just wanted to help and kind of be around and be a part of her recovery. But Nicole just couldn't deal with that super high energy right now. She could barely have a conversation without her head hurting even more. And she knew that Leisha and Durante didn't really get along too well, and so Nicole figured it would just be better for everybody if they pretended no one was home and Leisha just went on her merry way. But Leisha was very persistent and just continued knocking really loud on the front door. She began calling Nicole's phone, and so Nicole began reaching over and silencing her phone over and over again. And finally, Nicole looked over at Durante and just said, I don't need this. I'm going into my bedroom and I'm lying down. And so she grabbed her phone, she stood up off the couch, she could barely move, her head hurt so bad, and she walked, quietly past the front door, made her way into her bedroom, and she was about to lay down on the bed when she made the mistake of opening up her blinds just a little bit. Her room was on the front of the house as well, and she wanted to see if Leisha was still there. And when she opened those blinds, Leisha, who was outside, happened to be looking at Nicole's bedroom, and the two of them made eye contact. And Nicole's like, oh my God, she knows I'm here. And so Nicole, she just shuts the blinds. But now Leisha comes up to the window and she's yelling, Nicole, I know you're there. Come on, let me in. I want to help you. But Nicole, she just could not deal with it. And so she laid down on her bed and just continued to totally ignore Leisha. Nicole knew that no matter how offended and upset Leisha was for this snub, she would get over it because the two women had been friends for nearly 2 decades. 19 years earlier, they had been neighbors, and they had become friends really quickly. They had been pregnant at the same time, and they began raising their kids kind of like side by side. But in the last 5 years that Nicole and Durante had been together, Nicole and Leisha had kind of drifted apart because Leisha and Durante both had very strong personalities and they just kind of clashed. And Nicole and Durante had this kind of on-again, off-again relationship, and every time they were broken up, Leisha would come around and be totally unfiltered with Nicole about how much she didn't like Durante. But right now, Nicole could just not deal with Leisha, and so despite hearing her yelling for her to come outside, come on, I know you're in there, Nicole just rolled over on her bed with her ice pack on the side of her head, and she fell asleep. A few hours later, when Nicole woke up, Leisha was gone, as well as Durante. He didn't stick around for very long. He often would only come over just to check in, and then he'd go off and do his own thing. And so Nicole, who still had this blinding headache, she sat up, she got out of her bed, and she was only able to walk back out into the living room, where she laid down on the couch and just went right back to sleep. Even though Nicole had had this headache for 3 weeks and it had not gotten any better, she really was convinced that taking enough ibuprofen and relaxing long enough would cause it to go away. But over the next couple of days, this headache, which was already like a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale to Nicole, somehow became like a 20 out of 10, and it got so bad that she couldn't even open her eyes. It was like horrific. And as this headache got so bad, her relationship with Durante started to sour. Durante didn't really believe that Nicole was actually in the amount of pain that she was in, and he kind of began acting like she was just being lazy. And this really upset Nicole because that wasn't true at all. She was just in blinding pain and couldn't do anything. Finally, in late June, so 5 weeks after Nicole's headaches had begun, and at this point, her headache had still not gone away, she was laying on the couch, like always, with the lights off, she's got the ice pack on her head, and she's just trying to get through the day when she hears the back door open, and it's Durante, and he comes in, he slams the back door, he doesn't even say hello, and he just storms into the living room and just looks down at her with a totally disapproving look. And Nicole, she kind of looked over at him, and when she saw that look on his face, she had just had it, and she said, you know what? We're done. And immediately Durante got so mad, and he's like, how dare you? I've been taking care of you for the past 5 weeks, bringing you groceries, this and that. And Nicole, she had no energy to fight with him, and so she just let him rant and rave until finally he was done, and he walked out, and she was like, thank goodness. A few days later, on June 25th, Leisha was back at Nicole's house, knocking on the door. Nicole had actually texted her to let her know that she had officially ended things with Durante, and so feel free to come over, there's not going to be any drama with him being here. And so Leisha had come back over. She was very excited to see Nicole and kind of get over the snafu of her being ignored. And when she knocked, Nicole did go up to the door and she opened it up. And Leisha, as soon as she saw Nicole, this is like the first time she's seeing her since Nicole's headaches had really begun, she knew something was definitely wrong with Nicole. Her entire apartment is totally dark. All the windows are covered up. And Nicole is squinting out at Leisha, kind of beckoning her to come inside. And Leisha's like, oh my gosh, like how bad is this headache? And Nicole could barely make a sentence, and she just said, oh, it's so bad, it's so bad. And so Leisha came inside, and Nicole led her through the dark apartment to the kitchen and back. And Nicole, she sat down, and Leisha sat down opposite her. And Leisha began asking Nicole questions about her headache, about Durante, just kind of about her life. And quickly, Leisha realized that Nicole really wasn't making any sense. Her answers, even to the simplest questions like, what did you eat today, were in fragments and didn't really make any sense. And finally, Leisha said to Nicole, hey, this can't be a normal headache. This is something serious. You need to go to the hospital. And at this point, even though Nicole had been trying so hard to just kind of white knuckle her way through whatever was going on in hopes it would go away, she was starting to realize that there was something wrong here and she needed help from a doctor. And so Nicole agreed to go. And so Leisha would help Nicole up and kind of assist her out of the apartment and into Leisha's car, and Leisha would take her to the hospital. And when they got there, Leisha brought Nicole into the emergency room, and she explained to the nurses and doctors that Nicole had this terrible migraine. It started after she was in this minor car accident 5 weeks earlier. And so the doctors and nurses brought Nicole back to one of the rooms, and they began kind of treating her the way they would any other patient who had a serious headache. They asked her if she was hydrated. They asked what medication she was taking. They asked her what she was eating, how much sleep she was getting. They were just kind of going down the list of different things that could cause this headache, but nothing stood out as a red flag. Even the fact that she had been in this minor car accident and had some cuts on her face from the glass, that really wasn't enough for them to think, oh yeah, that would cause 5 weeks of a persistent migraine-like headache. They even looked at the cuts on her face to see if maybe they were infected or something, but they weren't. Basically, they had no idea what was causing this. But the doctors and nurses were very concerned because persistent, extreme pain in your head could be signs of a stroke or an aneurysm or something, both of which can be fatal. So they put Nicole through a series of imaging scans to get a look inside of her head to try to figure out what was going on. And after they finished all these scans, Nicole was brought back to her hospital room and she laid down on the bed. And even though she felt terrible still because of this headache, she at least felt like, okay, finally, these people are going to figure out what's wrong with me. They're going to give me medication. This headache's going to go away and I can get back to my normal life. But only a few minutes later, as Nicole is laying there trying to get comfortable, the door to her room suddenly burst open and a swarm of people came into the room looking very concerned. And in the middle of all these people was a guy wearing a suit, and he walked up to Nicole and he said he was a police detective, and he held up one of her scans and he pointed at it. But to understand what he was pointing at on her scan, we need to go back and look at what really happened on the day that Nicole got into that minor car accident. Back in early May of 2017, Nicole and Durante, who were still dating at this point, had just come back to Nicole's house after the two of them had been at a house party together. And Nicole was furious with Durante because at this house party, he had been openly flirting with another woman right in front of Nicole. And so Nicole, after going into her house, brought it up to Durante about how disrespectful that was. And Durante, instead of being apologetic or trying to defend himself or even lie about it, he actually just got really mad at Nicole and said, you know what, fine, I'm breaking up with you. And then he began going around her house, gathering up all of his things that he had left inside of her house. And Nicole, truthfully, was so mad that she didn't really care that he was putting on this show of taking his stuff and leaving her. And so after a few minutes of Durante angrily grabbing his stuff from inside the house, he headed outside to Nicole's car where he had some more things inside of her car. And so he went in the passenger seat, and Nicole, she just reflexively got into the driver's seat of the car just to make sure that Durante didn't take anything inside of her car that he shouldn't, or mess with her car in some way to get revenge on her. And so she's sitting there, she's watching Durante right next to her gather up his things, and then he hops out of the car, doesn't say a word to her, and then he walked around the front of her car and got into his car, which was parked right in front of hers, facing out towards the road. He climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and then he didn't move. And so Nicole, she's still sitting in her car, looking at Durante, hoping that he's just going to leave now, but he wasn't. And so suddenly feeling so frustrated and mad at him for everything, she turned on her car and drove forward, not fast or anything, and bumped intentionally into the back of Durante's car, and then she backed up to where she had been. And after she did that, she stared angrily at Durante, basically being like, what? Like, I want you to leave, like, get out of here. And Durante, he was furious. And so he threw his car in reverse and he really hit the gas and rammed into the front of Nicole's car. And in fact, he hit her car so hard that her car lurched backwards and smashed into her fence. Now, Nicole's memory only showed her this exchange. She remembered fighting with Durante, him getting his stuff, and then her bumping into him, and then him really hard smashing into her. And so when she thought about the minor accident she had gotten into, this was it. But what Nicole did not know as she was laying in the hospital bed, as this detective is holding up the scan and pointing at it, is there was actually a whole other series of events that played out after Durante backed into her. After Durante backed into Nicole and she smashed into her fence, Durante got out of his car, walked up to Nicole's car, drew a gun, and shot Nicole in the head. That's what happened. This was not a glass cut. This mark on her forehead was where the bullet went into her skull. But obviously, this did not kill Nicole. It knocked her unconscious, and Durante picked her up, put her in his car, and drove her to his mother's house, where he told his mother that, oh, Nicole was drunk and she got into a small accident and, she just needs to rest. And so Durante's mom, believing her son, put some Neosporin on Nicole's entry wound from the gunshot, put a Band-Aid over it, and kind of looked after her for the night. And then when Nicole came to, she had no idea what happened. Her memory only existed up until Durante rammed into her. She didn't remember him getting out and shooting her and all of that. And so when Durante realized that Nicole didn't know he shot her, he just went along with it and said, oh yeah, you got drunk and, we were fighting a little bit and you got into a small accident and I think the glass fell down and cut your head. That's all that happened. And Nicole believed it. It wasn't until Leisha made Nicole go to the hospital 5 weeks later and they scanned her head that they discovered a bullet lodged in her brain. And so the detective came in the room holding up the scan and he pointed to the bright spot on the scan, and that was the bullet. And the doctors and nurses, they told Nicole that we've never seen anything like this, like you should be dead. And also, because this has gone untreated for 5 weeks, your body healed around the bullet. Like, we can't even take it out now. Your brain has formed itself around the bullet, and so it will do more damage than good if we try to pull it out. And so Nicole would go on to live her life with this bullet in her head, but she never really fully recovered. As for Durante, the police would very quickly go after him, but he would flee police and evade them for 2 years. And then finally, when they caught up to him, he was hiding in an attic and there was this whole long standoff, but then finally he would surrender himself, and then he would get charged with a host of crimes, many of which he was convicted of. And so ultimately he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. On the afternoon of May 11th, 2015, 55-year-old Natalia was gathering sap inside of a Russian forest with her 82-year-old friend Valia. The two of them had been coming to this grove of birch trees for many years. They enjoyed the peace and solitude of nature, and it was also a good place for Natalia to bring her little dog so he could run around while they collected the sap. It was a perfect spring day. The weather was very mild, the sun was out, and the two friends had a great time just kind of moving around to the different birch trees, using their little drills and hammers to get their taps into the tree, and then they'd put their glass bottles underneath each tap to collect their harvest. And then at some point, Natalia felt like she had all the sap she would need, and she began gathering up her things to get ready to leave. And as she did that, she looked over at Valia, and she had found this really big birch tree, and she had sat down underneath it and was working hard to set her tap. And so as Natalia registered that Valia was over here, kind of doing one more tree before they left, she began looking around for her dog. And she found her dog, and he wasn't too far away from Valia, and he was just kind of moseying around one of the trees, when suddenly Natalia noticed the dog came to a hard stop, and it turned and looked deeper into the forest, like it had clearly registered something that had put it on alert that was out of view. And so Natalia, her view was obscured from whatever the dog was looking at, and so she put down her equipment and kind of moved between the trees to see what her dog was looking at. And at some point, her view cleared, and she saw pretty far off in the forest was something huge, this dark thing kind of moving behind the trees. And suddenly, it jumped out from behind the trees and ran towards the dog. It was a huge Russian brown bear. And so totally horrified, Natalia's watching this bear charge her dog. She looks over, she sees Valia, who's pretty hard of hearing, is sitting with her back to this bear and the dog, still just working on this tree. And Natalia's just frozen for a moment, having no idea what to do. And then instinct suddenly took over, and Natalia just turned and began running away, leaving Valia and leaving the dog. But after only running several paces, she she stopped and turned around and saw the bear is still trying to attack the dog, but the dog is standing its ground and barking at the bear, which is kind of causing it to back up and be a little unsure of itself, even though this dog is so much smaller. And still Valia is not reacting at all. She has not heard the bear, the dog, nothing. And Natalia, she's looking back knowing that she needs to do something. She can't just let her friend and her dog get killed. And so Natalia began walking slowly back in the direction of this bear, and she began screaming at Valia to get up and run with her. But the second Natalia began screaming, the bear went from looking at the dog to turning and looking at Natalia, and suddenly it was like the dog meant nothing. The bear had decided it was going to go after Natalia. And so Natalia, she's staring at this bear, realizing, oh my god, it's going to charge me. But before she could even turn to run, the bear had ran at full speed and jumped at her. Natalia turned and she tried to run, but the bear bit down on her thigh, and she felt it crush her leg and pull her to the ground and whip her up against a nearby birch tree. And she's screaming and trying to pull herself away, but the bear is ripping at her leg, trying to yank her back into the forest. And then Natalia, she sees her little drill that she uses to set the tap in the trees, and she reaches out and she grabs it, and she turns, and her leg is being actively eaten by this bear. And she turns on the drill and she's about to jam it into the bear's eye when the bear suddenly stands up to its full height and then just falls all its weight down onto Natalia's chest. And immediately Natalia dropped the drill and the bear clenched down on her throat. Now at this point, Valia, who again is hard of hearing, she didn't know what was going on, she turned around and saw this bear mauling her friend. And so what does she do? She runs over to this bear, right behind it, and begins pummeling this bear and screaming at it to get off her friend. And the bear, who barely registers Valia hitting it, it just lets go of Natalia for a second, it turns around, and you gotta remember, this bear has been eating Natalia. Its face is covered in her blood, and it turns and looks at Valia, and Valia, she's terrified, she begins stumbling backwards, and the bear is clearly about to jump on Valia when Natalia, who's barely alive, she sees this happening, and she just begins screaming at this bear while she's laying there bleeding out, trying to attract the bear to come back and keep eating her to spare Valia. And it works. The bear, hearing Natalia screaming behind it, forgets about Valia and turns back around and resumes eating Natalia. And then just seconds later, the bear actually lifted up Natalia by her neck and it ran off into the woods carrying her. And so Valia is just left watching this happen. She knows she's not going to be able to stop this bear. And so she just begins running back towards the car, which was not that far from where they were. And when she got out there, she grabbed her phone and she called the authorities. About an hour and a half later, hunters sent by the police, along with animal control, arrived at this parking lot, and they found Valia, who was totally in shock, and she would tell the hunters and animal control where this birch tree grove was, where all this happened, and a moment later, the authorities headed into the woods. And after arriving at the birch tree grove, they actually saw the bear. It was by itself, and it turned and looked at them, and it began charging them, and they all raised their rifles, and they fired at the bear. And they shot it enough times that the bear collapsed right in front of them, and then they shot it one more time to make sure the bear was dead. But there was no sign of Natalia anywhere. But then suddenly, the authorities turned and saw something move off in the distance, and out from behind a tree came Natalia's little dog. It had somehow not sustained any injuries from this bear, even though the bear had originally gone after the dog. And the dog, it came up to the authorities and then quickly doubled back behind a tree. And so kind of operating on instinct, the group followed the dog around the tree, and they saw the dog was closely guarding this kind of mound that was covered in sticks and leaves and dirt. And so one of the hunters walked over and looked down, and they realized there was a person underneath this mound. It was Natalia. They pulled off all of the dirt and the twigs, and they found her absolutely destroyed, mauled body. But Natalia was actually still alive. Brown bears are notorious for eating their prey while they are still alive. And in many cases, they will gravely wound their prey, but not let it die, because then the meat is fresher when they come back and eat it later. And so bears will wound their prey and then basically bury them, cover them up with sticks and dirt, kind of like putting it in the fridge, and then come back and eat them later on. And so Natalia was earmarked to be eaten later because she was still alive and buried. Natalia was rushed out of the forest to a nearby hospital, and she would stay there for several weeks because she had serious injuries from this bear. All over her body were these huge bite marks, and a lot of the flesh from her leg had been pulled off. But amazingly, she would recover, although the trauma of nearly being eaten by a bear has never left her. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. I grew up in a family where talking about our feelings was totally normal, and so as a result, I remember thinking that I would never be depressed because I'd be able to get ahead of whatever I was dealing with before it became a much bigger issue. But fast forward to 2017, when I had just left the military and I was trying to find my way in the civilian world, and suddenly I just felt mad all the time, even though I didn't know why. But instead of talking about my feelings to someone, like I had been raised to do, I just bottled that anger up, and eventually it turned into a full-blown depression. It turns out the reason I was able to talk about my feelings when I was a kid was because I wasn't really struggling, but as an adult, when I had real mental health issues, suddenly talking about what was going on with me felt impossible. Luckily, when I was struggling, my family noticed and they convinced me to go see a therapist, and truly it changed my life. So if you're struggling right now and you're just bottling up the way you're feeling, stop doing that and consider going to therapy. And a very easy entry point into therapy is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a brief survey, then you can talk to your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether it's via text, chat, voice, or video. You can also switch therapists at any time at no additional cost. Go to our sponsor, betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp and get matched with a therapist who will listen and help. On October 20th, 1986, Captain Alexander Kluyev was piloting a passenger plane that was about to descend down into a Russian airport for a layover. On board this plane were 94 occupants, including passengers and crew. And as the captain began going over in his mind the different steps he would need to follow to land this plane, he practically sighed with boredom. He had always thought life as a pilot would be exciting and interesting, but all he ever did were these short commercial flights around Russia, and they lacked any sort of thrill. In fact, the captain had flown this particular route so many times, he could practically do it in his sleep. And so as the captain was about to begin yet another boring descent to end yet another boring flight, he was suddenly struck with a very unexpected idea. And as he thought about it, he stopped what he was doing and he just turned to his co-pilot, whose name was Gennady Zernov, and he said, "Hey, Gennady, can I ask you something?" At the same time that Captain Alexander and Gennady were having this conversation up in the cockpit, down on the ground inside of that Russian airport where the captain was supposed to land, an air traffic controller noticed on their radar that Captain Alexander's plane was coming in way too fast and at too steep of an angle to attempt a landing. And so the controller radioed up to the captain and said, "Hey, you're going too fast. Adjust your speed, adjust your angle. Otherwise, you're going to need to abort this landing." But the captain did not radio anything back to the controller. Instead, the plane continued its descent at the same angle and the same speed, and to the controller's horror, they looked out the window and literally saw the plane was lowering its landing gear. Like, clearly they are going to attempt to land, even though this looks so dangerous. And so the controller, in a bit of a panic, radios again up to the captain and says, "Hey, you're still coming in too fast, too steep of an angle, abort the landing." But again, the captain did not respond. What Captain Alexander had said to Gennady when he said, "Hey, can I ask you something?" was, "Hey, do you want to make a bet that I can land this plane blind?" And Gennady, who was also very bored, thought, "You know what? That's a great idea. Let's do it." And so the two pilots lowered all the shades inside of the cockpit, blocking all of the windows, so Captain Alexander literally can't see anything except for his instruments. And then Captain Alexander attempted to land the plane. And when the air traffic controller began calling up to Captain Alexander saying, "You're going too fast, your angle's wrong," Captain Alexander was sure he could pull it off, and so he totally ignored the controller and went for the runway. And when he hit the runway, he was going too fast at too steep of an angle, and so it broke off the landing gear. The plane skidded all the way down the runway and then flipped over and caught on fire. Out of the 94 people who were on board that plane, 70 would perish, including the co-pilot Gennady Zernov. As for Captain Alexander, who orchestrated this whole tragedy, well, he actually survived, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. On December 7th, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaap sat inside of a hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany, staring anxiously at the nurse who was doing her blood pressure. When the nurse was done, she would tell Diane that her blood pressure was still too high. And so Diane, she sighed, and she was pretty upset by this, but at the same time, she wasn't all that shocked. After all, Diane had come to the hospital because she thought something was wrong with her. Diane was an American who lived on the nearby Sickles Army Airfield Base along with her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaap. And that morning, Diane had begun to bleed, and because she had a history of miscarriages, she panicked and just rushed to the hospital to get checked out. Now, ultimately, the doctors would tell her that it seemed like she was going to be okay and that the bleeding was not a big issue, but as a precaution, they wanted her to stay in the hospital for a week, just doing bed rest, where they could watch her and make sure she was really okay. And so far, she was, but her blood pressure was still too high. The nurse who had taken Diane's blood pressure finished doing the rest of Diane's vitals, and then afterwards, she left the room, leaving Diane alone. And Diane, now, it's the first time she's been alone inside of her hospital room since she arrived, and suddenly she just felt so anxious about the whole situation. And so as she's laying in her bed, wondering if her pregnancy was really okay, she heard footsteps out in the hallway, and then suddenly her door busted open, and it was her husband, Stephen. And Stephen, his skin was pale, his eyes were red, he looked really upset, and he rushed into the room, and he kneeled down next to Diane's bed, and he took her hand, and he just said, how are you doing? It had been a really hard stretch lately for Diane and Stephen. Just a few months earlier, Diane had actually asked Stephen for a divorce because she felt like Stephen had grown distant and the love was just not there anymore in their relationship. As for Stephen, he didn't want the divorce. He felt like their relationship was still good, they still loved each other, but he understood Diane was clearly unhappy, and so he was very gentlemanly about this whole situation, and even went with Diane to the base's cleric, where they arranged for Diane to be sent back to the United States while Stephen stayed in Germany. But before Diane was able to make that move back home, she had discovered that she was pregnant. Now, Diane knew Stephen really wanted to reconcile and get back together, and especially now that he had found out she was pregnant, he really wanted them to get back together so he could be the dad. But Diane knew that just was not possible. Their relationship just didn't work, and so she needed to be firm, and so she actually squeezed Stephen's hand as he's sitting there right next to her, and she just said to him, even though he hadn't brought it up, she said, we can't get back together, even though I'm pregnant. It can't happen. But Stephen just kind of shook his head at her like he was not here for that reason. And he said, look, I just want to be your friend. Let me go back to your house. I'll gather up your things and bring them here to make your stay a little bit more comfortable. And so Diane, who wanted to tell Stephen, no, don't do that, I'm fine, she could just tell that he really wanted to help her. And so, kind of against her better judgment, Diane said, okay, Stephen, if you want to go back and get my stuff, I would really appreciate it. And at that, Stephen stood up and he gave Diane a long hug and said, I'll be right back. And then he turned and left the room. A few hours later, at around 5 p.m. that evening, the phone inside of Diane's room began to ring. And so Diane answered it, and it was her husband's best friend, Gregory Glover. And he was calling just to check in on Diane because he had heard she was in the hospital about some bleeding, and he wanted to make sure the baby was okay. And Diane would tell him that, it seems like everything's fine. And then after that, Gregory would tell Diane that he was really worried about Stephen. He said, this morning I had driven him to work, and all he did was pour his heart out to me about how he wanted to get back together with you. And I just want you to know that, he's really worked up about this. But before Diane could even respond to Gregory, the phone just suddenly went dead. And so Diane, she held the phone out, kind of staring at it like, what's going on here? She put it back to her ear. She said Greg's name a few more times, but the line was just totally dead. And so Diane, she hung up the phone and figured Gregory would just call back. But 30 minutes went by and Gregory did not call back. And then out in the hallway, Diane began to hear running. And that running continued all the way up the hall and it stopped right outside of her door. And so she turned to face her door. The door flung open and what she saw caused Diane to just freeze in total shock. A few hours earlier, after Stephen had left Diane's hospital room, he had gone straight to her house to begin gathering things up for her. And so when he got there, he had a gym bag, which was made by a sports and athletic company called Head, and he had gone inside of her house and begun going around the rooms, gathering things she would want, and putting them in this bag. And at some point, Stephen made his way into Diane's bedroom, and suddenly he was just kind of overcome with sadness because he looked around the room and he saw there were still pictures up from their wedding day, and there was a card that was face down on the bedside table that he recognized, and just all of these different things he was seeing just suddenly made him feel so depressed about losing his marriage. And so Stephen, instead of continuing to gather up things for Diane, he just began pacing back and forth inside of her bedroom, thinking about ways he could potentially win Diane back. Maybe there was a gift he could give her, or some sort of offering or gesture that would show her that he still loved her very much. And so as Stephen was thinking about this, he happened to glance down at his gym bag, and suddenly he felt totally inspired, like he knew exactly what he needed to do. And so without another thought, Stephen grabbed something off of the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom, he threw it inside of his gym bag, then he grabbed the bag and walked out of her house. Once Stephen was outside, he had a big smile on his face. He was even whistling as he walked, and he went down and he got into his car and he drove off. But instead of going to the hospital where Diane was, Stephen began driving in these weird loops all around Sickles Army Airfield Base, almost like he was going on a joyride. But as he was driving, Stephen was constantly scanning left and right, like he was looking for something. And then at some point, as he did one of his many loops, Stephen passed by the mess hall, the cafeteria, and he saw all the soldiers going in and out of this mess hall, and he thought, oh, that's where it will be. The thing I need is inside of there. And so Stephen, he parked his car, he got out, and he rushed inside of the mess hall. But after looking all around, he couldn't find the thing he wanted. And so frustrated, he turned and walked out of the mess hall. But when he went back outside, as he was walking back to his car, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he looked over, and it was this phone booth right on the sidewalk up against the road. And he couldn't believe it, but there it was. There was the thing right near this phone booth that Stephen desperately wanted. And so Stephen, instead of going to his car, just began walking in a straight, very determined line towards this phone booth. 30 minutes later, Diane heard those running footsteps out in the hallway, and then her door flung open, and she froze in shock at what she saw. Because what she saw was her husband, and he had this totally crazed look on his face, like he was smiling, but kind of deranged, and he was holding that Head gym bag. And he walked in holding the bag and just stared directly at Diane, and then he opened it up, he reached inside, and he pulled out his special gift, the thing he had been driving all around base for, that he had found inside of that phone booth, and he walked up to Diane, and he put it right in her face and said, look what I brought you, look. And by this point, Diane was screaming bloody murder. It would turn out, when Stephen first arrived at Diane's hospital room that morning, and he had knelt down and taken her hand and asked if she was okay, Diane had been very firm with him that they could still not get back together even though she was pregnant. Now, this was crushing news for Stephen because he did secretly hope that this baby would bring them back together, but what Diane told Stephen next was infinitely more crushing. She would say to Stephen that the real reason they could not get back together was because this baby was not his. Now, Stephen had initially taken this news pretty well and said to Diane, okay, I understand, at least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you and bring them back here so your stay at the hospital is a little bit more comfortable. And Diane had maybe been a little bit surprised at how well Stephen had taken this, and she said, okay, yeah, that would be great. And so Stephen had left the hospital, gone to Diane's house, he went into her room, and he began putting her things into that gym bag when suddenly he stopped because he noticed those pictures on the mantelpiece of their wedding day, and it was just kind of crushing to realize that his marriage really was over. And then, before he went back to packing, he happened to glance over at the bedside table, and he noticed a card face down on that table. Now, at first, Stephen actually didn't really react to this card because he knew who had given it to Diane. It was just a friend of hers, and the card was kind of meaningless. It was just a card to celebrate their friendship. But then Stephen's suddenly thinking to himself, wait a minute, this person, this friend of Diane's, gives her cards all the time. And this person is always coming over to say hi to Diane. And this person's always complimenting Diane and telling me how great Diane is. And it was like suddenly everything just kind of fell into place for Stephen. And he realized this so-called friend of Diane's was much more than that. This friend was Diane's lover and very likely the father of her unborn child. And who was this friend of Diane's? Well, none other than Stephen's very best friend, Gregory Glover. The same Gregory Glover that Stephen just that morning had poured his heart out to on the ride to work, telling Gregory how much he missed his wife and how much he wanted to reconcile. And Gregory's advice to Stephen had been, well, I know you're hurting, but you really need to let this go. You need to let the divorce happen and just move on with your life. And now Stephen realized that Gregory wanted Stephen to end his relationship with his wife so Gregory could have a relationship with Diane. And so Stephen felt unbelievably betrayed. And that was when he decided to get a gift for Diane. And so he grabbed a knife that was on the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom. He threw it inside of his gym bag. He got in his car and he began driving around the base looking for Gregory. And after Stephen had gone into the mess hall and then come back out again, he had spotted Gregory on the phone inside of that phone booth. And Stephen had immediately run over, opened it up, grabbed Gregory, pulled him out, and begun stabbing him. Now, Stephen didn't know this, but at the time he attacked Greg was literally on the phone with Diane. And so when that call suddenly dropped and Diane expected Gregory to call her back, well, their call really hadn't dropped. It was just that Gregory had been pulled away and was being attacked. Gregory, who was totally caught off guard, tried his best to defend himself against Stephen, but Stephen was just crazed and he kept hacking away until finally Gregory had stopped moving. And then at some point, Stephen stood up and kind of caught his breath and he's looking around at all these onlookers who can't believe what they're seeing. And Stephen said, "I'm sorry." He grabbed some things off the ground, put them inside of his head bag, and then he took the bag, he ran to his car, drove to the hospital, ran through the hospital to Diane's room. He flung the door open, and Diane is shocked to see him. And Stephen walks in with this crazed look on his face, and he holds up the bag, he unzips it, and pulls out Gregory's severed head. And he holds it right in front of Diane and says, look what I brought you, look. And he placed it down right on the bedside table, looking directly at Diane. And so Diane began screaming and people began rushing into the room. Meanwhile, Stephen just sat in the corner calmly, waiting to be arrested. Ultimately, Stephen would be tried by a military court and he would be sentenced to life in prison. In 1889, when Karl Tanzler was just 12 years old and living with his family in Dresden, Germany, he had a very strange dream. In this dream, he found himself in this black void where everywhere he looked, it was just nothingness. And then behind him, he heard footsteps. And so he whips himself around and he looks, and there's this woman dressed in this big, puffy, elegant white dress walking towards him out of the darkness. And when she walks right up in front of him, she comes to a stop and she introduces herself as Anna Constantia von Brockdorf, who was a real person in the early 1700s. She was a noblewoman in Germany, and she would tell Karl that she is actually a distant relative of his, and that she was here to pass on a very important message. Karl was rooted to the spot. He didn't know if he should be afraid of what she was going to say, or excited, or nervous, but before he could decide, Anna had already turned and was pointing in the direction she had appeared out of. And so Karl turns and looks in the direction she was pointing, and out of this blackness, out of this void, came this woman's face. It was a face detached from a body. It almost looked like a floating picture of a woman's face. And as this face floated closer and closer to them, Karl was immediately struck by just how beautiful this woman was. Her hair was jet black like a raven's feathers, and her skin was white like porcelain. But there was something off about this woman, this floating face. She looked sad and kind of frail. And so as Karl found himself staring at this face, which was now right next to them, Anna spoke to him again, and she would tell Karl that this woman, the floating face, she's going to appear in your life later on, and it is your mission given by God to save her. She's going to be very ill, very sick, and you need to find a way to keep her alive. Then Karl, in real life, woke up, and immediately he was struck by just how visceral that dream had been. It really felt like that had just happened to him, but after a few moments, it seemed like, okay, that was just a dream. But unlike other visceral dreams he had had in the past, this one did not gradually fade from his memory. Instead, over the course of that day, the memory specifically of the raven-haired woman's face really seemed to become more clear and more concrete in his mind, to the point where at the end of that day, he could easily remember exactly what she looked like. Over the following days and months and years, Karl periodically would have this same dream, this same vision of his distant distant relative Anna who would come out of the void, and she would remind him to be on the lookout for this raven-haired woman when God sent her to him. But despite these constant reminders in his dreams, and Carl being ever vigilant to look for this raven-haired woman in real life, he never actually found her. He never met this woman he was supposed to save. Fast forward to 1926, Carl was 39 years old. By this point, he had gotten married, not to the raven-haired woman, but instead to a local woman in Dresden. And the pair had had 2 daughters together, and they lived a simple life. And, by and large, Carl seemed rather content and happy with his life. However, secretly, he was a little disappointed that these dreams, these visions that he was having of Anna and the raven-haired woman, that they had not come true, that it really had just been a dream. That year, due to an economic downturn in Germany, Carl and his family left Germany and emigrated to the United States, where they believed there would be better opportunities for them. And when they arrived in the United States, they settled in Central Florida. But within a year, Carl and his wife had a severe falling out and they split up. And so Carl would leave the family home in Central Florida, and he would resettle several hundred miles south in Southern Florida in a town called Key West. And it would be in Key West that Carl would get a job as an X-ray technician at a local hospital, and it would also be in Key West that Carl's life would change forever. Less than a year after settling in Key West, Carl was at the hospital going about his day when an older woman walked into the office, and she said to Carl that she was there to get her daughter, her 21-year-old daughter, an X-ray of her chest because her daughter apparently couldn't stop coughing and they were concerned about it. And so Carl began doing the paperwork with the mother when suddenly the daughter came into the office. And as soon as Carl saw her, he knew immediately that she was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. She walked in and she sat down in a chair, and Carl just stopped what he was doing and stared at the daughter. And then he kind of broke out of it and turned his attention back to the mother, and he said to her, "Ma'am, don't worry. I will do everything in my power to save your daughter's life." Now, the mother didn't know what was wrong with her daughter. And so this was both really helpful that this man she was talking to was so willing to help, and also kind of ominous that he was already insinuating that she could be dying. But either way, the mother said, "Thank you very much. We really appreciate that." And so Carl and the mother, they finished their paperwork, and then Carl quickly left from behind his desk and hustled over to the daughter, and he introduced himself and he reiterated that she was in good hands. And the daughter was a little bit weirded out by this, but she was polite and said thank you, and she said her name was Elena. And so Carl would take Elena and bring her back and give her the X-ray, and unfortunately he would discover through this X-ray that she had tuberculosis. Today, that disease is easily curable, but at the time, that was a death sentence. When Carl saw this, though, in a weird way, it almost made him happy, because this was another indication that, this really was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. Not only did she look the part, but she also had arrived in desperate need of help. And so now Carl needed to find a way to save her. Even though he was just an X-ray technician, he was not a doctor, and so he had no clue how to begin to treat tuberculosis. But that didn't stop Carl. Over the next year, Carl would be in touch with Elena and her family on a near daily basis, updating them on all of the new techniques to fight tuberculosis that he was doing all this research on, and he would tell them about experimental procedures and drugs they could try, even sometimes paying out of pocket for them to go try them. He would also bring Elena into the office as often as he possibly could to X-ray her again and again and again to see if perhaps she was making good progress. But unfortunately, over the course of that year where he was doing everything he could, it just didn't work. The disease ravaged Elena's body, and on October 31st, 1931, so roughly a year after Carl had first met Elena, Elena would unfortunately pass away. Elena's family was devastated by this, but their grief didn't even compare to Carl's grief. It was like Carl had lost his life too. He couldn't believe he had failed his mission and let the raven-haired woman die. When it came time to bury Elena, Carl said, "Let me pay for the most elaborate gravesite we can possibly make. Let me set up a mausoleum for her." A mausoleum is an external building that sits in a cemetery that effectively serves as a kind of shrine to the deceased. And so her family, they understood that Carl had become very, very very close with Elena, although they didn't fully understand the relationship, but they did understand she meant a lot to him, and so they agreed to let him do this. After Elena was buried inside of this small temple that Carl had built for her, Carl began spending virtually all of his time kneeling inside of it, crying and begging for Elena's forgiveness. Elena's family was well aware that Carl was doing this, and at first they kind of just let it happen, but after several months, they began to tell Carl, you really need to let her go. You need to begin to move on. But Carl refused. In fact, over time, he only became more and more obsessed with Elena. Finally, after 7 years of Carl doing this, Elena's family decided, enough is enough. He really needs to stop making her loss all about him. It's not his loss, it's our loss. We're her family. And so the family decided the only way to kind of get Carl to stop doing what he was doing is to demand he give the key back that gave him access into the small area inside of the mausoleum. So one night, Elena's sister, whose name was Florinda, decided to go over to Carl's house unannounced and confront him and get the key back from him. And so she hopped in her car and she drove over to his property. His house was kind of set back off the road behind some trees, and so you had to drive down this kind of winding driveway to get to it. And so Florinda turned onto his driveway and she began driving, and when his house came into view, the first thing she noticed was a number of the windows on the first floor were all lit up. Clearly, Carl was home, and as she's driving towards the house, she's just looking in these windows, and for a second, she sees Carl, and he's very elegantly dressed in a suit or a tuxedo, and he's ballroom dancing with this woman who's also very elegantly dressed as well. And for a second, Florinda considered turning around and not disturbing him, but then she thought, you know what, this has been going on for so long, I just need to get this over with. And so she drove her car and stopped in front of Carl's house. She hopped out, she walked up onto his porch, and she knocked on his front door. Inside, she could hear music was clearly playing, but just a few seconds after she had knocked, the music was cut off, and then no one came to the door. And so Florinda knows there's people inside this house, and so she knocks again, but again, there's no movement in the house. It's just silent, as if the people inside are pretending not to be there. And so finally, frustrated, Florinda knocks on the door a third time and says, "Carl, I know you're in there. I have to talk to you about my sister. Please come out here." And so finally, she heard the shuffling of feet, and then she heard the sound of the door unlocking, and it opened up just a crack. And through this crack, Carl looked through, and he looked out at Florinda very suspiciously, and he said to her, "What do you want?" And Florinda would say, "Look, I'm here to talk to you about my sister. Can I please come inside for a second? Or can you come out here and talk to me?" But Carl pretty much immediately said no, and then he shut the door. However, before he shut the door, Carl had very briefly stepped out of the way, allowing Florinda to see through that gap into the house. So before the door actually shut, she got to see who and what was inside that house. And what she saw was the woman Carl had been dancing with, and the woman was seated in a chair maybe halfway through the house, and she was facing the door. And Florinda knew immediately it was her sister. And so she's standing on the porch having no idea what to make of what she's just discovered. And so feeling kind of overwhelmed, she just kind of staggered off the front porch. She turned around, she ran into her car, and she drove off to tell the police. When the police came back, they knocked on the front door and they demanded that Carl let them see the woman he was there with. And so at this point, Carl knew the gig was up, and so he opened the door and he allowed them to come inside. And when the police went inside, they saw the woman he was with, and sure enough, it was Elena. However, Elena was deceased and had been for 7 years. After her death, Carl said he was able to talk to her inside of her mausoleum, and so that was why he was going back there every single night, because he and Elena were spending time together. And then at some point in 1933, so 2 years after Elena has been dead and buried, Carl would say she told him while he was visiting her mausoleum that she didn't like being in the mausoleum and that she wanted to come back with him and stay at his house. And so the following day, Carl had shown up with a child's wagon, and he pulled her out of her coffin, pulled her out of the mausoleum, put her corpse in this wagon, and wheeled her back to his house. He had continued to go to the mausoleum every night for the next 5 years just to keep up appearances, but Elena's body never went back inside of it. She would stay at his house, where he painstakingly attempted to restore Elena's very badly decomposed body to its original form. He strung piano wire through her entire body, connecting all of her bones together to keep her skeleton intact, he replaced her eyes with glass eyes, and he began rubbing the special wax all over her skin. He also stuffed her insides full of rags in order to give her a full, natural look, and he constantly sprayed her with perfume to reduce the smell. Once she was, in his eyes, back to normal, he began spending as much time with her as he possibly could. He would change her outfits constantly, he would put on makeup, and he would give her new jewelry, and he would talk to her about the ups and downs of life. He would laugh with her, he would cry with her, he would sleep with her. Carl would admit that ultimately his goal with keeping Elena in his home was to eventually still save her life. He believed if he could somehow get her body up into the stratosphere, that the radiation up there would bring her back to life. And if he could do that, he would be fulfilling his God-given mission to protect her. But Carl never got a chance to launch her into the stratosphere. Instead, he was charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. However, these charges would be dropped and Carl would be set free. As for Elena, her body was returned to her family and they would bury her in Key West. On August 23, 2013, inside of a little home in a Russian suburb, 8-year-old Maria Chelyasheva was hard at work at her kitchen table drawing a picture of a horse. Maria's parents had recently brought her to a farm where she was able to do some pony riding, and ever since then, she had become obsessed with horses and ponies. And so as Maria was hard at work on her drawing, her father, 42-year-old Mikhail, was right nearby at the kitchen stove dicing up onions, and as he did, his eyes were kind of watering from cutting the onions, and so he was making a show of turning around and looking at his daughter, pretending to cry, and Maria thought it was very funny. And then at some point, as Mikhail was doing this, he realized he was missing a key ingredient for the dinner he was preparing. So he kind of threw up his hands in exasperation, and then he yelled out into the house to his wife, hey, do we have any potatoes? And from somewhere in the back of the house, Maria's mother called back, yes, we do. They're down in the cellar, but they're pretty old. And so Mikhail finished chopping his onions, he threw them into a hot pan, and then he walked out of the kitchen, poking Maria playfully as he walked by, and she kind of laughed at him. And then Maria watched as her father walked through the living room, past Maria's grandmother and brother, and he walked over to this door that was right at the beginning of this hallway, and that door led down into the cellar. And so Maria, she stopped for a moment and just watched as her dad opened the cellar door, began walking down the steps, and he shut the door behind him. And then Maria just went back to coloring in her horse. But after a few minutes, Maria started to smell something really bad, and she looked up and she saw the onions that were on the burner were starting to burn, and smoke was going up into the ceiling, and then suddenly the smoke alarm went off, and as this commotion is happening, Maria's grandmother runs into the kitchen and begins fanning the smoke. She turns off the burner and moves the onions, and then Maria's mother comes running into the kitchen, and she's seeing what's happening, and she's looking around. She doesn't see her husband, and so very frustratedly, she yells out, Mikhail, you burned the onions, come in and deal with this. But Mikhail was not on the first floor. He was still down in the cellar. And so Maria's mother knew that, and she was kind of annoyed that he was taking so long down there. And so after muttering something under her breath, she stormed out of the kitchen, walked over to the cellar door, opened it up, went downstairs, shutting the door behind her. Meanwhile, back in the kitchen, Maria's grandmother was now going through the burned onions, looking for any that were salvageable, and Maria had gone back to her horse drawing. But after about 5 minutes, it dawned on Maria that her parents had still not come out of the cellar yet, and it just felt like too much time had passed. They should be up by now. And so Maria stopped working on her picture and just stared down the hall at the cellar door. And at the same time, Maria's grandmother had stopped with the onions, and she too had come over and was watching from right next to Maria down the hall at the cellar door. Both of them just expecting the parents to emerge any second. But as the seconds ticked by, nobody emerged from the cellar. And so finally, Maria's grandmother said, okay, I'm going to go see what's going on. And so Maria watched as her grandmother walked through the living room, past Maria's brother, who was playing a video game. And then Maria's grandmother, right in front of the closed cellar door, just yelled out, hey, are you guys okay down there? But there was no response from the cellar. And so with this, Maria's grandmother turned around and told Maria's brother to turn off his video game because it was so noisy. Maybe they were calling from the cellar and they couldn't hear them. And so the brother, who was just totally frustrated by this whole situation, he paused his game. And then Maria's grandmother called out again, hey, are you guys okay down there? And this time, when there was still silence, Maria's brother, he just stood up and said, okay, why don't we just go downstairs and make sure they're okay? Why aren't we doing that? And so without waiting for a response from his grandmother, Maria's brother just walked right over to the cellar door. He opened it up and he looked down and he goes, look, they're right there. And then the brother began walking down the steps, yelling to his parents, hey, come on, when's dinner? What's going on? And as he did, he shut the door behind him. And so after this, Maria's grandmother walked back into the kitchen and sat with Maria as the two of them stared at the cellar door, expecting their family to return any second now. But they didn't. And so at this point, both Maria and her grandmother were really starting to panic. They could tell something was wrong. And so Maria's grandmother grabbed her phone and called a neighbor and just said, hey, can you come over? I think something's wrong. I don't know what it is. And then after Maria's grandmother hung up the phone, instead of waiting for the neighbor to come over, Maria's grandmother just got up and walked right over to the cellar door, then opened the door and began walking down the stairs. But this time, the grandmother left the door open. And so Maria was able to listen from her seat in the kitchen to the sound of her grandmother's footsteps making their way down the stairs. And then at some point, Maria heard what sounded like a distinct thud and then silence. Now, at this point, Maria is terrified. The neighbor has not come over yet. And so without knowing what else to do, she just got up and walked over to the open cellar door and just stared down into the darkness down below. She couldn't see anything, but she was too scared to even call out to her family. And then finally, she just began descending the stairs herself. 10 minutes later, the neighbor who Maria's grandmother had called finally arrived over at their house. He knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. And so he tried the doorknob, found it unlocked. So he opened it up and he stepped inside. And right away, he looked around and it was totally quiet. There was nobody on the first floor of the house. But the neighbor immediately heard crying, and he walked around the first floor listening for where it was coming from, and he realized when he got to the top of the open door leading down into the cellar that the crying was coming from down there. And so without a thought, the neighbor just ran down the stairs, and he couldn't believe what he found. He found Maria, the 8-year-old, just crying on the ground, and all around her was her entire family just laying on the ground. Now, the neighbor had no idea what was going on, but sensing clearly there was some sort of emergency based on the call he got and what he was seeing now, he just scooped up Maria, ran upstairs and ran out of the house and began screaming for help. When help arrived, they would search the house and make their way down into the cellar, and they would discover that Maria's entire family, her grandmother, her brother, her parents, they were all dead. And what had killed them were the very potatoes that Mikhail had gone down to get. It would turn out Maria's mother was right when she warned Mikhail that the potatoes they had downstairs were very old. In fact, they were so old, they had begun to rot, and as they rotted, they produced this toxic fume that did not ventilate out of the cellar. The cellar was totally enclosed, there was no windows, and the family had this habit of always shutting the door whenever they went down into the cellar. And so over time, this fume had totally filled the entire cellar, and one by one, as family members went down into the cellar, sealing the door behind them, they passed out from these fumes and then died. Maria was the only one who survived going down into the cellar because her grandmother, who had gone down right before her, had left the door open. And so by the time Maria had gone down, a lot of the toxic fumes had found their way up the stairs and escaped into the rest of the house. And so when Maria went down there, it was not nearly as toxic. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Before I became a professional storyteller, I was a member of the US Navy. And then in 2017, my military career came to a very unexpected and abrupt end. It was like suddenly I was a civilian again after 7 years, and I did not handle that transition well. I had taken for granted all the structure that the military provided on a day-to-day basis, and so not having that structure anymore, it made me feel totally lost, like I didn't know what to do anymore. And on top of that, all the bills were starting to pile up, and I had not found a job yet. My wife is pregnant with our second kid. I got no idea if we'll even be able to afford this second child. And so I very quickly went into my shell and became a very angry and bitter person. And at some point, my anger issues got so out of hand that my family had a sort of intervention with me and told me, hey, you gotta see a therapist. And I would agree, and it would completely change my life. My therapist quickly showed me that I was not this terrible, angry person, but instead, I was someone who was going through a major life change, and it was making me depressed, which is pretty common. And so with my therapist's help, I was able to adjust to this change in my life and really focus on the future and all the good things that were going to happen. And in time, I became a very happy person, and I still am today. Now listen, therapy is not for everyone, but if you feel kind of lost right now and you don't really know what to do, I think you should give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need from the comfort of your own home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a brief survey online, and then it's up to you how you communicate with your therapist, whether that's via text or chat or video or phone call or some combination. Also, you can switch therapists at any time at no additional cost. Go to our sponsor, BetterHelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp, and get matched with a therapist who will listen and help. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go into the like button's fridge and dump out their 2-liter of Coke and then refill the bottle with flat root beer. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast that puts out brand new, never before heard stories every Monday. And then also on Thursdays, we put out remastered audio from YouTube videos. And so that podcast is called MrBallen Podcast. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find it. If you want to get in touch with me, you can send me a direct message on any major social media platform. My username is the same on all of them, @MrBallen, and I really do read the bulk of my messages. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. We have MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes, and we have a new channel called MrBallen en Español, and it's a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page called MrBallen that puts out near daily content, as well as a Snapchat channel that puts out content every Sunday. We have some really cool merchandise, so if you want to have a look, head on over to shopmrballen.com. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, podcasts, additional YouTube channels, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. As much as I love whipping up old Sing-a-Long's favorite meal, a nice hot fluffy mug of musk. A nice hot fluffy mug of muskox and blobfish stew. Sometimes I just don't have enough time. And when that happens, my quick option is a couple of mystery bird nuggets. However, as we learned last night, old Sing-a-Long is allergic to emu. Emu was the mystery bird we sucked down last night. So unfortunately, mystery bird nuggets are out. However, I found an even better quick option, Factor. With Factor, you can skip all those grocery store trips and all the prepping and chopping and cleaning up that comes with preparing a full meal, but you still get the top-notch flavor and nutritional quality that you need. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes, so all you gotta do is heat and enjoy. And Factor is flexible. I can adjust my order size to make sure I have enough to share with my family, and it's easy to skip a week or 2 anytime you know you're not gonna be around. For those of you who are confused, because I've previously stated my favorite meal kit is HelloFresh, well, don't worry, HelloFresh owns Factor, because HelloFresh wants to offer a wider array of meal options to satisfy all of their customers. So if you're in need of a quick meal option to replace your mystery bird nuggets, then look no further than Factor. My favorite Factor meal is the grilled chicken with browned butter Yukon mash. It's pretty good. Head to factor75.com or click the link down below and use code MrBallen50 for 50% off your first Factor box.